Hey, this is Todd, and I'm starting a new series of videos today, which I'm calling Film to Table. I think it's a cute play on words, but whatever. It's just looking at bringing in the concepts and sort of devices from, fiction, movies, TV, books, whatever, but looking at them from a standpoint of using them, in your RPG at the table, as part of your game, as opposed to looking at them and kind of what they do in fiction. I think oftentimes when we're looking at these devices, they get mentioned in various places. I think that there's an assumption that's made that, you understand what these things are. And there's not often a lot of talk about sort of what it means in terms of the game, as opposed to in terms of how it's used in the fictional source material. This video, I think I'm going to spend talking about basically a couple of concepts, really because I want to sort of separate them and define them, because I'm going to be using them a lot later on in other videos, and I want to make sure that we sort of have a shared understanding, and that's looking at sort of plot versus story. I think oftentimes they get used interchangeably, and I think often they are interchangeable when we're talking about some things. Like I said, in fiction, you may talk about the plot, you talk about the story, and they, I think, for all intents and purposes, are essentially the same. However, I think in terms of looking at them for a role-playing game, I think it can be useful, and I will find it useful for these to separate them out to talk about two separate things. So when I talk about story, I'm talking about things that emerge during play. And when I'm talking about plot, I'm talking about things that are pre-planned by the referee, by the dungeon master. So, for example, when someone's planning on a campaign and they're talking about, okay, they're going to start in this village and they're going to do this job for the Duke, and then the Duke's going to send them here, and then the big bad evil guy, whatever, a hag, let's say in this example, does this, then they're going to respond to do that, and then we're going to go on these adventures, and it's finally going to culminate with them heading into the hag's lair deep in some haunted wood and defeating her. That is the plot, right? That may also be the story, but the story is really what happens at the table, at least the way I'm using the term, is what happens at the table when it's actually playing. So within that plot, there may be lots of stories that emerge that have nothing to do with that plot. It may be stuff that, well, they go to town to see the Duke, but then one of the players gets in trouble. They have to rescue him out of jail, which then leads to this other thing. And that becomes a whole little mini episode in itself. It wasn't something that the referee pre-plotted. It wasn't planned, but it's a story. And so I think when we're talking about movies or films and things that are all sort of pre-planned, or at least they're all written out, right, they become sort of the same, that there's no story in a novel, let's say, that hasn't been plotted out by the writer, obviously. But when we're talking about a game, there's this sort of stuff that's planned on paper by the referee, which I'm going to call the plot. And then there's all the things that can happen, some of it messy, some of it small, some of it large, that are going to happen at the table. And that is the story. And again, I don't mean to suggest there's only one. There can be multiple stories that happen during a plotted out campaign. One, if they do it all the way to completion, will basically be the plot, more or less, depending on how sidetracked they get. But there might be all kinds of other stories that happen either in addition to the plot, maybe instead of the plot. Oftentimes, GMs will talk about story, plots being derailed, and it may turn into something else. All that sort of stuff that happens in play. And I might sound a little bit strange at first, the way I'm using it, but I think it's going to help sort of keep things straight. And I'll try to keep reminding myself and in the video just to keep everyone on the same page for what these things talk about. And just as a related note, I think we talk about, which I think adds to the confusion, sort of story games versus simulationist games. People will look at D&D and say, oh, that's a simulationist game. People will look at something like a Played by the Apocalypse game, say Monster of the Week, maybe, as a story game. But I feel like often it's, particularly nowadays, it's a false dichotomy, right? If you look on Reddit, if you look at people who are dungeon mastering, refereeing D&D games, they're doing lots of story-driven games, right? Back in the day, I think it's kind of a definition that maybe started from looking at D&D the way it used to be played way back when, that was maybe more applicable then it isn't now. I think when I think of simulationist, I'm thinking of, if you look at the Rithlandar Chronicles or other stories and tales of games that were played at the very beginning of the hobby, you're talking about basically the the referee would sort of lay out the world and lay out these sort of mega dungeons and kind of put the players into place. But then everything outside of that was sort of, adjudicated through random tables and other things, so that he was not trying to plot a story of they're going to go to this place and talk to this person. They're going to go here, they're going to go there, they go there, and then they're going to defeat this evil guy at the end. It was really player driven. It was really more or less, if there was a plot, it was the endless plot of delving as far as you can into these dungeons, which doesn't really have an ending. It doesn't really have any sort of narrative to it. It's just what happens when these players are going and doing this activity. Now, all the stuff that did happen, those are stories. There were stories that would emerge, that kind of emergent play from doing these things. I remember one that I read. They go into one of the dungeons, and I think they face an evil cleric, and they lose that fight, and they surrender. And the cleric puts them under a Gaius or similar spell, basically a quest to have them go and do something for him, some evil plot. He wanted them to go and destroy somebody else who was a threat to this cleric. So the heroes, they go back to town, they heal up, and they think about it, and they think, we don't want to do this. We don't want to help this guy out. So they figure out some way to get out from under this quest or Gaius spell, and then they go back, and I don't know if they went back right away, or maybe they geared up and leveled up, or, in other words, they figured out what they needed to do to beat him. They go back in, and they defeat the cleric and end that threat, right? That's a story. But my sense of it is that this was not something that was planned out by the referee who was running that group of ventures. The cleric was probably a random encounter. Maybe he rolled some reactions or some morale that made the cleric seem amenable to taking a surrender instead of just killing them. And taking players prisoner and putting them under spells, having to do stuff is kind of a staple. So that might have been something that was not necessarily planned, but obviously an idea once that they saw, oh, they're surrendering. But the point is, it wasn't something that he sat before the game and said, here's what's going to happen, right? And then, all these things sort of led from sort of events that were not pre-planned. They sort of came out of bubbled up through the world, which usually back in the day was represented by, random tables. That to me is sort of simulationist, because you created this world, you're simulating it, and stuff happens that just comes out of these rules that you've set up. It's sort of, you create the rules for the world and you sort of let it go. It's like an ant farm, and then you let whatever happens to the ants happens. Modern D&D, for the most part, is not like that. People are not just setting up these worlds and just letting them spin, right? They're setting up specific situations. They're setting up certain outcomes they want, sort of lines of action that they want. And this is all story driven. We're all creating stories, creating campaigns. The idea of the campaign in the modern sense of going and starting at A and going through B, C, D, E, F, and then ending at Z when you're taking on the big bad guy, that is totally story driven. Now, a Played by the Apocalypse game may sort of wear their story on their sleeve. They're more transparent about it. If you play a lot of these games, they'll talk about things in terms of scenes, and they'll talk about things in terms of, hey, if you're playing Monster of the Week, you know exactly what you're doing. Each week, you're going to fight this monster, and the book will go through and basically give you, here are the kind of things you're going to do. It's very laid out, and it's very understood. Whereas often with modern D&D is you're also doing the sort of story thing. And I think if you look at the average gamer, they also understand the sort of plots and sort of things that will be happening in a D&D game. Only it's layered under a veneer of simulation, or maybe open world or sandbox, where the dungeon master, the referee, isn't going to just cut short actions to go move the plot forward. They will allow players and parties to maybe meander or waste time or go off course, right? Whereas maybe in another game that's more transparent, they're gonna, if a scene is running over and you're in the shop and you got all the information you need, they're just gonna end that scene, move on to the next one. Maybe a D&D referee might be more likely to let that scene kind of play out and then walk you back to the hotel or the inn you're staying at. And if stuff happens on the way to the inn, you just kind of keep playing it out. So you're sort of meandering and it's less focused. But underneath that sort of veneer of, hey, you're just doing whatever you want, it just so happens that stuff is going on, there is a story at play, or there is a plot at play. And as you're playing through that plot, you are creating a story much in the same way you are in these other games. There's just that layer. And I think maybe if there's another difference, it's that it's more equally collaborative between player and referee in a Played by the Apocalypse style game, or that kind of story game, right? Where a referee might ask a player directly, what was here? What do you think that was? And that will add to the world. That can happen. And some people will play their D&D type games like that. It doesn't tend to happen as much. It's not sort of the default way of playing, whereas a lot of times it's actually in the rules as something that's part of the gameplay. In a D&D game, it tends not to be, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. So there is that sort of element that oftentimes is different. But in the end, both kinds of games, for the most part, are about sort of story as plot, right? We call them story games. Maybe really should be kind of plot games where you have these points you're moving towards completing an arc with, oftentimes some sort of end climax, and you're done. That is the plot. And the stories are all the stuff that happens when that actually gets into play at the table. And the story can sometimes be the plot, but the story can also be other things than the plot. And a lot of what, that I'll talk about in other videos and things you run into on the web are when these things, what happens with games and referees when these things don't mesh up. Because you think in the ideal world that your plot and your story are going to mesh. Your characters, the characters of players are sort of fully invested, and they're just going to march and just go boom, 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 boom down the line of this plot, and that's the story, right? But sometimes, often, it doesn't work out that way, and that's when you start talking about, like, what can you do to prevent that from happening? When you're talking about plot hooks, that's really how are you reeling your players into that first part of your plot, right? How are you getting them into this plot sequence? Because that they need to know it exists. Two, you think about it in a way they need to be enticed, right? Like a fish in a fishing line, you need to put something on that hook to get them attached to it. When you talk about, when someone might mention that, hey, this NPC had plot armor, right? What they're really referring to is that this NPC was important to the plot that's happening, so the referee had to protect them. Because, another thing that happens is there's somebody that's important. They've placed them in a spot in the campaign, and the players decide either to ignore them, to kill them, or do whatever. And, as a referee, you saying, hey, wait a minute, they're on plot point 2, and they killed the guy that I need on plot point 8. I can't have that happen, or I'm not going to allow them to do that. So I'm going to make sure that person gets away, survives, whatever, right? Plot armor. So there's a lot of things that enter into play when we will talk about plot and these different elements. I just want to make sure that it's separate from the idea of story. Maybe when we think of history and all the kind of messy little things that happen during the game, because, particularly with D&D style games, it will often not be a smooth, nice parabolic arc. It's going to be lots of bumps and things. And a lot of that is stuff that you actually want. Those are the things that you remember as a player, is not necessarily the overarching story of the plot that you did in that campaign, but all the fun little things that happened, the moments and what led from that were maybe not part of it at all, were totally unexpected or, unasked for, unwanted, but that occurred. Those stories are often the most interesting. And, often as a referee, what you're trying to do is balance your plot and keeping them on point to tell that story, and then also allowing the freedom for these other stories. Because I think when we talk about railroading, which is a much, maligned term, from a player perspective, really you feel what it is, what I would define it as, is when you feel that the plot is constricting you, that you no longer have that freedom of movement that you felt like you had. If there was a veneer of the game, you have this plot moving underneath the surface, but there was this illusion that you could kind of move around and do things. And I don't mean a total illusion like you can't ever, but just that usually as players and everything, that you're on this track, right? But you want to feel like you have choices on the track. You want to feel like maybe it's a branching path, or that if it's not branching, at least the path has some width to it, so you can kind of pick and choose and do things and have freedom to maybe make a diversion over here or change something over here. When you feel that the path is so narrow that you basically can only walk down that line, down the plot, that's when you feel that you're being, railroaded as a player. I think oftentimes as a referee, there's a lot of railroading that happens behind the scenes. That's not a bad thing. But I think when the players feel it, and when they're going to mention it as railroading, it's always about them feeling it in a negative light. No one will talk about railroading, at least I haven't really seen it from a player's perspective, as a positive. It's really that visceral emotion of, hey, I'm on a railroad. I can't get off. I have no latitude to do things. So that's, something else we'll talk about, in terms of plot versus story, when they begin to diverge, right? When the players maybe want to tell and their characters want to tell a story over here, but the plot is, over here, and how the GM does the referee try to force them together, or does he give them latitude to do both, or how they do that. So we're going to talk a lot about that. But anyway, I just wanted to get those concepts out there and the way that I'm going to use them in particular, because like I said, if you're on Reddit or you're out there, I think you're going to hear people just throwing them back and forth. Maybe they mean the same thing. Maybe they're talking about them as different things. So for these videos, I wanted to be clear about what I'm talking about, so that at least when I'm using the terms, we can sort of keep them straight. And I think there's a lot of things that happen when they're either, closely meshed together, when they separate, and sort of how you deal with that. And so for me, it's a good thing to keep them separate and not try to think of them in terms of the same thing. So just to reiterate, so when I'm going to talk about story, I'm talking about the sort of things that emerge at the table, which may be related to a pre-planned plot, but that's beginning by GM, but that might not be. And the plot is those pre-planned path that the referee has planned for the party to take, has organized for the party to move down, a trail of events, of things happening from the beginning of their campaign or adventure to the end of that campaign or adventure. So it is the pre-planned path. The story is all the little things, including whatever detours and mini stories and other things that the players may do when they actually engage with the game at the table. So I hope that wasn't too boring. I think I'll try to get into maybe more exciting things, more interesting things down the line, but I feel like I needed to get that base out there before going forward. So stay tuned for more of these. I'm going to have a playlist that I'll create. It'll be called Film to Table, where I'll be putting all these out. I'm going to try to keep them on a steady schedule. I think the first couple I'm going to do, I want to do the MacGuffin, since that's a really easy one. And I think it's a term that gets thrown out all the time. But it's something that I think once I define it, if you don't know already, it will be super obvious because it gets used all the time in role-playing games. I also will go over the hero's journey, because I think that's one that is very useful for role-playing games, but it also has some limitations in terms of a game as opposed to other types of fiction. So I want to talk about that. I'm not sure which one I'll do first. The MacGuffin is definitely an easier one. It will be a shorter video, and the hero's journey more involved and longer. So we'll see how that goes. If you have suggestions or you'd like to see one before the other, please let me know, in the comments or in Reddit, which I will link to in the show notes. If you like these videos and the other videos that I do, please think about subscribing to the channel. It helps me out a lot. I also have a link to a Patreon that is posted in the show description. So if you feel like supporting me in that way, that's great. But other than that, I will talk to you later.